And intro done. Hey y'all, it's Becky here from the Beckisphere, where we talk about climate news and solutions. You have entered the climate recap, where we talk about what can be done to reduce the impacts of and prepare for climate change. Again, not mitigate and adapt, because that's climate jargon. Anyways, this week we're going to do 2 weeks worth, because if you look at my most recent polls on Instagram and Twitter, and also on my YouTube community tab, I asked whether or not I should keep doing weekly or whether or not I should end up doing bi-weekly, and y'all mostly agreed bi-weekly would be better, so that I can then have the opportunity to do deep dives and stuff like that. So that is what I'm doing, which means y'all are getting more content per time, so that will be fun. This week we're going to talk about news from September 10th to 24th. So let's go ahead and get started. A new study out of Yale Climate Communications looked at different people's reactions to different names for natural gas based on their political affiliation. They asked people about terms natural gas, natural methane gas, methane, methane gas, fossil gas, and fracked gas. Did you get all that? Both Democrats and Republicans responded positively to natural gas and negatively to methane and methane gas. The parties diverged when it came to fossil gas and fracked gas, with Democrats finding them both negative and Republicans finding them both positive. This really shows the power of words, and from now on, I'm basically going to be calling it methane gas, because we're choosing the one that's negative for both parties. A new report by the International Energy Agency, or IEA, looked at where the majority of methane emissions are coming from. The top culprits are the US and Russia. Downstream emissions, or emissions that come from the liquefied natural gas, or LNG, terminals, compressor stations, underground storage tanks, and distribution. For example, when we're talking about the methane in Romania last week that was leaking out of those facilities, those would be considered downstream emissions. The agency actually cited a report by the Clean Air Force, which did the report on Romania's gas leaks. Downstream emissions represent up to 20% of all emissions made in 2020. 80% of emissions created in the European Union and Japan are represented by downstream emissions. So that would be cutting a lot of their emissions if they were to reduce that particular form. The good news is that downstream emissions can be reduced by 75% just by updating infrastructure to current technology. Again, methane is a low-hanging fruit in reducing greenhouse gas emissions, because a lot of methane emissions come from infrastructure leaks and from illegal flaring activity. So right now there are very few regulations covering methane emissions. So if we were to just regulate it, then we wouldn't have this problem. Great. A few days after this report was released, the US and the EU agreed to cut methane emissions by a third by 2030. They did not specify which methane emitting practices they would actually focus on to make this happen. Harvard University ended their indirect investments in fossil fuels, recently valued at $42 billion, the most of any US university. Yet it only represents less than 2% of their overall endowment, which really just shows how much they make. This week was a good week for Alaska wilderness. The House Natural Resources Committee passed legislation to restore protections for the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge and the Outer Continental Shelf against fossil fuel companies. It will go into the larger reconciliation package, which needs to get passed. The bill will also provide money to the Citizen Climate Corps, cleaning up abandoned hard rock mines and restoring and increasing resilience to the Great Lakes. Then the Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, blocked the large gold mining project that was set to take place in Alaska's Bristol Bay, using the power of the Clean Water Act and arguing that it would hurt the largest sockeye salmon run in the world. Unlike previous Alaskan nature wins, this one was very much bipartisan, with popular Republicans such as Donald Trump Jr. actually arguing for the mining project to be closed or to not open because it would be too risky for the salmon population, including pink, coho, and chum salmon. Quote, "It is essential to the livelihood and the community well-being of many Alaskan tribes. And it is also one of the most productive salmon fisheries in North America. It is a unique resource that needs unique protections." The mining company, called Pebble Limited Partnership, argues that the green transition will require mining minerals and still believes that this project will find its way through and will become one of the most important domestic mining operations in the US. We will wait and see. Speaking of which, a new Silicon Valley-based startup called Cobalt Metals, backed by Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos, uses artificial intelligence to scope out metal reserves needed to shift to EVs and renewable energy. Cobalt Metals recently partnered up with the world's largest mining company, BHP. Quote, "We need roughly $10 trillion worth of new discoveries of lithium, nickel, cobalt, copper, and rare earth minerals just to be able to fully electrify the world's passenger vehicle fleet." It's confirmed that the hottest summer in US history tied with the summer in 1936 that brought about the Dust Bowl, which was an extreme drought that exacerbated the Great Depression era. California had a 5-degree hotter average at 77 degrees rather than 72 degrees this summer. You can see current fires blazing in the West by clicking the link in the resource section below from the New York Times, which tracks the different wildfires going on. And I'll tell you, we recently went to Lake Shasta and we were getting smoke from the river complex and the Monument Forest fires in the West. It wasn't the worst I've seen it though, to be honest. Like, we've literally battled fires to get to Lake Shasta. We're kind of crazy, but it was definitely still hazy. Thankfully now it's been recorded that the Dixie Fire is 90% contained, so very good. The extreme drought in California, as well as population growth, has forced the state to start looking at other ways of getting fresh water, like desalination, getting fresh water from the ocean, water recycling, and pumping water from deeper underground. But according to a new report by the nonprofit Next 10 and think tank Pacific Institute, these efforts could result in a higher water-related greenhouse gas emissions if water conservation wasn't implemented effectively. So you can read more about their findings by clicking the link in the source section below. A new NOAA report found that the US Southwest has been experiencing its worst drought on record. They started recording in 1895. It spurred the first ever federal water shortage declaration of the Colorado River and its lakes, which we might check out later. Indigenous-led resistance is a perpetually underrepresented part of a climate movement, at least in my opinion. We don't talk about it as much, but a recent report by the Indigenous Environmental Network and Oil Change International found that Indigenous-led resistance to 21 fossil fuel projects in North America within the past decade has stopped or delayed the amount of greenhouse gas pollution equivalent to at least a quarter of the continent's annual emissions. About the equivalent of about 400 new coal-fired power plants. That's right, believe it or not, it could be worse. If not for First Nations often literally blocking construction sites with their bodies and challenging projects in courts. Military leaders met in Seoul this week to talk about how climate change is interrupting military effectiveness. Panelists were from the US, France, Switzerland, Netherlands, India, and Bangladesh. The Chief of Defense and Chairman of International Military Council on Climate Change and Security said that militaries had the responsibility to prepare for what is to come. Quote, "I cannot remember another conflict in my military experience where we had this level of scientific foresight. We know what's coming for us." They discussed the implications of sea level rise and severe heat. They worry that extreme heat could render their military equipment useless, and apparently they've already been seeing that as an issue. They're also concerned about how it will destabilize societies. Quote, "Today, no nation can find lasting security without addressing the climate crisis. We face all kinds of threats in our line of work, but few of them truly deserve to be called existential. The climate crisis does." Recently, I've noticed that my fellow climate informers have been up in arms about blue hydrogen, and honestly, that's fair because straight up blue hydrogen, which comes from a byproduct of natural gas, aka it's methane, is not clean by any means. And yet it's being currently greenwashed horribly as it being green. So considering it as a form of clean energy is disingenuous. If you ever see that as the case, roll your eyes. So to that vein, the head of the UK Hydrogen and Fuel Cell Association resigned last month over this controversy. He released an opinion on oilprice.com talking about how high prices of blue hydrogen actually make it not even economically feasible. He claims that fossil fuel companies and companies like Citigroup mislead the public about the facts. You can read more about his opinions in the source section below. It's very interesting. The UK Business Department and the oil and gas UK companies have been citing climate change committee out of context to justify new developments in the North Sea. The CCC, one of those, has not said anything that would suggest that they support that project and have said that they would only approve fossil fuel projects if there was strong justification. And the only type of fossil fuel projects that they've actually said anything about so far was onshore fracking, which they have called a moratorium on. So, quote, "The CCC expects continuing demand for fossil fuels over the transition to net zero, but the fact alone does not justify investment in new oil and gas fields. We have not reviewed the future oil and gas development beyond onshore fracking, where we have recommended a moratorium. We await details of the UK government's promised climate compatibility checkpoint on oil and gas licensing." A coalition is pushing on the U.S. Congress to revise a long-standing tax credit for installing residential solar and other clean tech that would be more available to low-income and communities of color. It's called Residential Renewables for All and is made up of 350 organizations and individual advocates, including the National Wildlife Federation, the NAACP, the Union of Concerned Scientists, and Black owners of solar services. The group argues that there isn't available credit for 26 million households because they don't have sufficient taxable income. A record number of environmental activists were killed last year, 227 people according to Global Witness. This beats 2019 that held the previous highest record. A third of the murders were linked to resource exploitation like logging, mining, big agriculture, hydroelectric dams, and other infrastructure projects. The report calls them environmental defenders. Since the Paris Climate Accord, environmental defenders have been killed at an average rate of 4 a week. Thousands of conservationists, scientists, and diplomats voted at the International Union of Conservation of Nature, or IUCN, to have a global moratorium on deep-sea mining and exploration contracts unless environmental protections can be confirmed. Quote, "Allowing deep-sea mining would mean the deep ocean would be exploited before it's even explored." Wildfires are sweeping through the Malaga province of Spain. The fires have already burned over 17,000 acres with more than 2,500 people evacuated. Tropical storm Nicholas hit the Texas coast as a hurricane, leaving thousands of Texans in the dark. And then it went to mess up the already messed up Louisiana. Poor Louisiana. Formosa Plastics paid about $2.85 million in settlements for injured workers via air pollution and factory fires and explosions at their petrochemical site in Texas. Quote, Formosa repeatedly failed to comply with the chemical accident prevention provisions of the Clean Air Act at the Point Comfort plant, repeatedly placing their workers, neighbors, and the environment in danger. A new Pew Research poll shows that 80% of people in developed countries are willing to change how they live and work to reduce climate change impacts, with 72% being very concerned about climate change. This is a very big consensus, a very big consensus. The poll also found that less than half of people think that the international community is doing enough to combat climate change, and that little over half think that their country is doing a good job in reducing and preparing for climate change. Most of the disdain for the international effort falls on the US and China, the two largest emitters. Something else I found interesting is that while the vast majority of countries' opinions on climate change are trending towards caring more, Japan is actually caring less. What's with that? Give me your thoughts. I'm really confused on why that would be the case. There are plenty more results to come from the survey, so check it out in the source section below. Arcadia, a startup that provides people with the option of accessing renewable energy in their area, has raised $100 million to expand operations. It gained new investors in Tiger Global Management, the Drawdown Fund, Wellington Management, and Reimagine Ventures. They are also supported by Energy Impact Partners and G2 Venture Partners. If you live in the US, you can see basically how to access full clean energy via Arcadia. So I recommend checking that out. Of course, it's in the links below. Why wouldn't I? Vermont became the latest state to sue fossil fuel companies on the grounds of providing false information of the environmental impacts of their products. The state is suing ExxonMobil, Shell Oil, Sunoco LP, and Citgo Petroleum, among others. Meanwhile, Illinois signed into law one of the nation's most ambitious state-level clean energy plans. Called the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act, Illinois is now on track to have a carbon-free power sector by 2045 and 100% clean energy by 2050. It's the first Midwest state to plan for a carbon-free future. The Los Angeles County unanimously voted to end oil and gas drilling in its unincorporated areas, citing local health concerns. The vote would take over 1,600 oil wells offline, though the timeline for this has not yet been determined. By doing so, it becomes the first county in the US to end current drilling projects. Michigan is constructing the nation's first segment of road that will be charging electric vehicles while they're driving. No, I haven't looked further into that yet, but maybe I should. Quote, Michigan was home to the first mile of paved road, and now we're paving the way for the roads of tomorrow with innovative infrastructure that will support the economy and the environment, helping us achieve our goal of carbon neutrality by 2050. Whoever wrote that line they should get extra money for that one. Yeah. Paving the way to roads of tomorrow. That's a good one. I think the top of my feet are gonna burn. Yeah, they're already burning. The UN reported that 90% of the $540 billion in global farm subsidies given to farmers every year actually damage people's health, fuel climate change, contribute to the destruction of nature, and drive inequality by excluding smallholder farmers, many of whom are women. A side note is that supporting women smallholder farmers is an important solution mentioned in Drawdown, the Bible of climate activists, and the coffee table book to the home of every environmental activist. Basically, the UN argues that these current subsidies support big agriculture, particularly meat and dairy industries, which is a huge carbon-emitting industry. Without reform, the levels of subsidies will soar to $1.8 trillion by 2030, which is basically money down the drain because it will be holding up a suffering industry. This study was published ahead of the UN Food Systems Summit, which is today. Actually. Oh, yesterday. It was Thursday. Yeah. 30 climate activist groups penned an open letter to 24 companies, including Apple, Walmart, Coca-Cola, and Amazon, that have made climate pledges and yet are being represented by lobbying groups that are at least partially opposed to the $3.5 trillion legislation, which is the nation's best shot for changing our current climate trajectory. These lobbying groups include the Business Roundtable and the Chamber of Commerce. An independent effort via satellite data, machine learning, and AI to track greenhouse gas emissions of every country, known as Climate Trace, has released its first results. The project is a collaborative effort between Al Gore, the think tank MRI, Transition Zero, Watt Time, and others. They found that the world's top countries that submit regular oil and gas production and refining emissions might only be reporting about half of what they're actually emitting. A few countries were right on the money with their emissions records, though. The project also found that more than 1 billion additional tons of CO2 equivalent are going unaccounted for by countries that are not required to submit regular data. You can look up your particular country's emissions by looking at the Climate Trace link in the description below. According to DeSmog, UK ministers have met with fossil fuel and biomass firms 9 times more often than clean energy companies. These are the same ministers that are supposed to be holding the most important climate talks in history in just 2 months. And according to the Climate Action Tracker, Gambia is the only nation in the entire world that is currently on track to meet the Paris Agreement goals, aka they are doing their part to keep global warming under 1.5 degrees Celsius. The only industrialized country that even comes close to reducing its emissions enough to Paris Climate Agreement levels is the UK. And that means that they're basically on track for keeping their part of the global warming at 1.5 degrees Celsius. We are in deep trouble the way the world is going right now, just straight up. And are any of us that have been following the climate recap surprised? Got some more fun ones for you. The World Resource Institute and Climate Analytics joined forces to release a report further emphasizing how screwed we are at the moment. They found that the world is currently on course to see 2.4 degrees Celsius of warming by 2100, or 2.1 degrees Celsius of warming if unformalized pledges like China are incorporated. Now, keep in mind that these targets and pledges aren't actually the same as policies, which are still few and far between. Instead of hitting a 45% drop in emissions by 2030, as the Paris Agreement requires, we're on track of increasing emissions by 16% during that period, according to a new UN report. This is based on the Nationally Determined Contribution, or NDC, updates provided by countries to the UN ahead of COP26. Quote, "The 16% increase is a huge cause for concern. It is in sharp contrast with the calls by science for rapid, sustained, and large-scale emissions reductions to prevent the most severe climate consequences and suffering, especially of the most vulnerable throughout the world." And the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or OECD, updated its report on climate finance provided by developed countries to developing countries to say that developed economies are falling short of their 2009 pledge to mobilize $100 billion annually by 2020 to help developing countries cut emissions and adapt to warming. Many developing countries say that they cannot make clean energy and emissions reductions targets without that financial help. Quote, "The limited progress in overall climate finance volumes between 2018 and 2019 is disappointing, particularly ahead of COP26. All this and the results of the following survey are totally unsurprising. A new survey conducted by researchers at the University of Bath interviewed 10,000 people ages 16 to 25 in Australia, Brazil, Finland, France, India, Nigeria, the Philippines, Portugal, the UK, and the US about how climate change makes them feel. Over half believed that humanity is doomed, and about 45% said that climate anxiety affects their daily life. Depressing, yes, but I'm 24, so that's actually my demographic, and I feel that.
I empathize with the doom. I feel the doom.
But you can't give into it.
You can't give into it.
No.
The real estate industry is investing in Fifth Wall, a B Corp venture firm focused on technology for the industry to decrease its carbon emissions. They've also raised $140 million, and their goal is to reach $500 million. This is the first time we're seeing the U.S. real estate industry make moves like this towards reducing their overall emissions. The building sector amounts for approximately 38% of global emissions. Salesforce, a customer relations management company that owns Slack, announced it has reached net zero emissions through its value chain. This has a lot to do with buying carbon credits, though. So the next goal is for them to actually get to 100% renewable energy by 2040. The company also publicly supports the infrastructure bill. Ford has partnered with the battery recycling company Redwood Materials to prepare a domestic supply chain for electric vehicle batteries to be recycled and reused, a closed-loop system. The idea is we won't always have to mine for new minerals to satisfy future EV needs. Blue Oval SK plans to open several battery plants in North America starting in 2050 and aims to use some of Redwood Materials' recycled materials. Shell announced that it's selling its Permian Basin assets to ConocoPhillips. While ConocoPhillips plans to continue to increase its oil equivalent to 200,000 barrels a day by 2022, Shell is moving to diversify its business to low carbon sectors. Note that that's not no carbon sectors, that's low carbon sectors. Shell has been under especially high pressure after the Netherlands sued them earlier this year. In a way, they are deviating from their fossil fuel peers by not continuing full steam ahead with new projects, and yet they're also not following their European peers by investing in renewables. Instead, they're working to make their shareholders a lot of big bucks. You can read more about what they're doing in the source section below. Leonardo DiCaprio has invested an undisclosed sum in 2 lab meat startups, Mosa Meat and Aleph Farms. Dutch-based Mosa Meat made the world's first cell-based hamburger, while Israel-based Aleph Farms produced the first cell-based steak. Quote, "One of the most impactful ways to combat climate crisis is to transform our food systems." During the UN General Assembly, Biden promised to mobilize the promised $100 billion for developing countries with a goal of reaching over $11 billion annually by 2024 from the US. During this same meeting, Chinese President Xi Jinping also pledged to end overseas finances for building new coal-fired power plants. China is the largest public financer of overseas coal plant construction, so this is a big deal if they keep their promise. Over 70% of global coal plants from the Green Belt and Road Initiative rely on Chinese funding. More than 3/4 of the world's coal power projects proposed since late 2015 have been scrapped, according to a new report by the climate think tank E3G. 44 countries have committed to stop initiating new coal projects. Yay, the red button. Okay, my camera died, and we, the dedicated people, brought it back, charged it, and brought it back to the almost exact location. Okay, and we sunblocked because Becky was getting burned. All right, anyways. So where was I? Right, okay, bottom line is that the world is exiting coal. The US should too. And we're kind of in process with that, except unfortunately, the person that is now the most important Democrat for getting the $3 trillion package through is very invested in coal. Go ahead and take it away, Seth Meyers.
The transition to clean energy is actually cheaper and more cost-effective than fossil fuels. We just need it to happen faster before we reach the tipping point of irreversible climate destruction, which is why we still need government subsidies to push it along. The problem is that the fossil fuel lobby is still doing everything it can to lobby against clean energy. And they have powerful allies in Washington doing their bidding, like West Virginia Senator Joe Manchin, who chairs the Senate Energy Committee. The New York Times reported that fossil fuel lobbyists, utility executives, and West Virginia business leaders have been meeting, calling, and emailing Manchin and his staff in an effort to shape the bill. And not only that, Manchin profits personally from polluting industries. He owns stock valued at between $1 million and $5 million in a coal brokerage firm, which he founded in 1988. Last year, Manchin made almost $500,000 in dividends from the stock. And how is it acceptable that the guy writing our climate policy personally profits from coal?
On Wednesday, 7 late-night talk show hosts focused their segments on covering climate change. My parents can confirm I've been pretty frustrated with a lack of coverage in that genre of news coverage because I just feel like they don't talk about it enough. But good for Stephen Colbert, Seth Meyers, Jimmy Fallon, James Gordon, Samantha Bee, Jimmy Kimmel, and Trevor Noah for taking part in Climate Night. John Oliver, I'm watching you. You didn't cover the IPCC report at all, and that was not impressive, so do better. I love you, John Oliver. I want you to do better. Okay, anyways, the event was organized by Steve Badow, the producer of Netflix Patriot Act by Hassan Minhaj, and is part of Climate Week NYC, or New York City, that is taking place September 20th to 26th. I'll leave a link about that so you can look at what events are being covered during that period of time for the rest of the time in the resource section below. And today, which is Friday, we are experiencing worldwide climate strikes. So if you participated in a climate strike, please let me know in the comment section below. I'm always interested to know who takes part in those. I would be, except I'm in the Grand Canyon and there's not any climate strikes here. So yeah. Anyways, that was the news from September 10th to 23rd. Whew. I have a feeling that there's gonna be a lot more news ramping up to COP26, so prepare for these videos to be a little on the longer side. And before I let you go, I wanna leave you with some topics to think about. If you are an educator or a journalist, you're invited to take part in the worldwide teach-in on climate and justice on March 30th, 2022. Check out that information in the resource section below. There's a new hashtag going around, hashtag Code Red. This is because scientists have called this a code red situation for the planet. And this idea has been emphasized through the Climate Week NYC, and they are recommending people to go onto the website Code Red Congress to bug your congressman about the upcoming infrastructure package vote. So that link will also be in the resource section below if that's something you would like to do. Finally, what do you think the world will look like in 2200? Well, Grist collected a bunch of stories by a lot of different storytellers to kind of answer that question. So if fiction is your style, then go ahead and check out those short stories in the resource section below as well. Until next time, remember to support your local news organizations and to talk about climate change every single day, because apparently only 14% of us do, and that's just not enough. Yep. Bye for now. Thank you for my Patreons for supporting my channel. A special thank you goes out to David H. and Vinus Fang. Thank you very much. If you would like to support me on Patreon, please consider looking at the link, which will be in the description section below. The tiers are about as much as a cup of coffee, depending on if you're buying from a local place or Starbucks.